I would like to introduce our speaker, but first wanted to say, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Adriana Souza Silva. I'm the director for the Center for Transformative Media. And I just wanted to say a few words about the center. So CTM is a hub at the intersection of grassroots creativity, emerging technologies, and media innovation, where creativity and social change converge to shape more equitable technological futures. Our center is dedicated to investigating the potential of emerging technologies for creativity and social change. We explore how emerging technologies transform society and our creative potential to develop new media technologies, as well as how people and communities use existing and emerging media in innovative and creative ways to improve their lives and contexts. That we have a lot of questions in the center, research questions, and mostly at the intersection of media and technology and society. So for example, how do emerging media technologies transform the ways we live, work, and learn? And how can these technologies be designed to serve communities, not only markets or industries? So what makes CTM distinctive is our commitment to creativity as grassroots innovation and network practices. We study not only how technologies are designed in labs and studios, but how also communities, and especially marginalized groups, adapt and repurpose them in inventive ways. For example, our research includes examining how people in situations of hardship creatively appropriate mobile technologies for survival and community building. We explore grassroots archival practices that preserve queer and trans narratives, and investigate how virtual reality can engage underrepresented students in STEM learning. This dual focus on top-down innovation and bottom-up creativity positions CTM at the heart of CAMD's mission to harness data and emerging technologies to advance human potential and solve challenges for the future. Especially now, following the universal trends, we are particularly interested in the study of AI as media, examining how artificial intelligence functions as a cultural and communicative force that reshapes creativity, knowledge production, and civic life. So rather than viewing AI as simply as a technical tool, we take a social-technical lens to explore how it operates as a cultural form that transforms storytelling, journalism, community engagement, and social interaction. For example, our research critically examines how AI systems influence public discourse and civic participation. These are some of the research areas that our faculty, we have a very large group of core and affiliated faculty, investigate things related to computational media and AI for social impact, data justice, networks and algorithmic accountability, digital archives, memory and cultural preservation, health, accessibility, and inclusive media futures, and transformative journalism and civic media. So with that said, I just wanted to point you to our website. If you want to know more about the center, that's our QR code, so you can scan, and there's also a QR code at the entrance as well. If you didn't take some of the swag, like we have a notebook and pencils and pens, so you can take for yourself. And these are some of our fall events. We're having our first event of this year. In October, we're going to have a film screening with 2 core faculty of the center that do documentary films. Then in November, we have a research jam about leveraging media history to improve journalism. And we're going to have another book talk from Caleb Gale, who's the center associate director, in November. So it's all on our website. With that, to put your slides, but I want to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jeffrey Boase. Jeff is an associate professor at the Institute of Communication, Culture, and Information Technology, also known as ECCIT, at the University of Toronto. He also holds a graduate appointment in the Department of Sociology. And he's also a member of the advisory board of the center. Jeff received his PhD from the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, and at which time he spent a year at Harvard University, right here, on a pre-doctoral fellowship at the Kennedy School. And after completing his PhD, he spent 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Social Psychology at the University of Tokyo. Professor Boase' research examines the role of communication technology in personal networks. Rather than treating technology as an external force that uniformly shapes personal networks, his work situates the use of specific communication technologies within a variety of networks, or like work, family, and friendship arrangements. This attention to the way in which practices of connection are formed within the context of complex social and technological configurations avoids simple technological or socially deterministic narratives and provides a nuanced account of the social implications of communication technology. So it's very related to what we do in the center. That's why we invited him for this talk. And his recent book, The Digital Byte, which is what he's going to be talking about today, was published in March of this year by Oxford University Press. In it, Jeff develops a new conceptual approach that helps us to understand the way in which individuals navigate the current technological reality of constant connectivity, which I'm sure you all experience on a daily basis. The book draws on a 10-year study led by Professor Boase and supported to a grant through the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The study draws and merges both qualitative and quantitative research and methods, including in-depth interviews with more than 100 adults, and the development of a new mobile data collection app that was used to collect digital trace and self-reported data from a nationally representative sample of more than 400 adults living in Canada. With that, so I'm going to let Jeff do the rest of the talk and present his book.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming out on this beautiful Friday. I really appreciate it. I know maybe it's a little tempting to be outside, but thank you for being inside with me today. Really, really great to see you. In this book there was one central question, which is, what are the social implications of constant connectivity now? We have mobile devices with us, they're always computers, they're always in person, they're always connected to the internet, so that's that kind of technological reality. And so the question is, how does that then potentially influence our relationships, right? What's that mean for social life? And I think of relationships very broadly as including not just personal friends, but also our family, the people we work with, all the people in our personal networks. So, with that, I'll just very briefly go over some early studies in mobile communication, because of course these are the studies looking at early constant connectivity, right? And there was typically a focus on what's called mobile bonding, which is this idea that with mobile phones, people are more likely to selectively pay attention to their close friends and family and form these kind of telecocoons, right, where they're constantly talking to these people, not just in person, but using their mobiles, texting them, calling them, and this results in these kind of monadic clusters, which are these sort of homogeneous little groups that we have with our close friends and family. These people tend to have the same worldviews of us, they tend to understand us deeply, we don't have to explain ourselves, and so there is a kind of bounded solidarity and kind of insularity that comes out of that. So a lot of various studies focused on that, right? And when they try to explain, well, why are the phones doing this to us? Why is it resulting in this sort of bounded solidarity? They would point to things like, well, if you look at the earlier phones, what could you do with them? Anyone recall what you do with the earlier phones? Talk and? Text, right? And how would you text? On this?
Pressing numbers 3 times.
Exactly, up to 3 times, each number to get 1 letter. So could you spend time, would people spend time sending very long detailed text messages? No. And so they would tend to text people who already knew them pretty well, knew what they were doing. They would have a lot of high context to interpret those messages, and they would tend to be short. So again, you can see, okay, technology seems to be causing this mobile bonding because the people you call are people you know you can interrupt, and they're not strangers necessarily, or if you text them again, they're short little messages. And so the concern again is that technology is sort of causing us to separate from everyone else around us because we're always on our phones. And this has been an ongoing concern, right? Now this concern does make an assumption of what you can think of as called the zero-sum hypothesis. Anyone heard of this? So the idea is, okay, if you spend more time on your phone, you must spend less time.
Sorry.
That's okay. Speaking of which, constantly connected.
Exactly.
If you spend more time on your phone, you spend less time, meeting new people, diversifying your networks, having new experiences with strangers, right? That's the assumption, that one causes at the expense of the other. But as we know, if we think about it, that's not necessarily the case. We do a lot of things in our lives that are not social, that are not meeting strangers and having all these new social experiences, like watching TV. So if there's a displacement of our time because we're spending more time on the phones, we could just be spending less time, say, watching TV or doing other non-social activities. And at the same time, when we are on our mobile devices, we can be concurrently doing other activities. And there's a lot of studies that have shown that people are not always off-putting other people around them when they're just looking at their phones. It's become sort of a normal behavior that people don't always interpret in a negative way. It's really context dependent, right? There's a lot more going into it than if I'm on my phone, then everyone around me feels alienated and that I'm not in the game. We know from our own experiences sometimes that's not the case. So the point I'm making here is that it may not be the case that technology is necessarily leading to one particular outcome, which is social isolation. It may be contributing in some ways, but it may not as well. And when I look at some of my earlier studies, particularly in Japan, I was finding that younger people who were the earliest to adopt mobile texting were using mobile texting quite a lot. This is like 2008 or so, 2006, 2008. They're using mobile texting quite a lot to actually build new relationships because they had these highly scheduled lives. Teenagers in Japan, typically, they go to school for a point of time, and then they often have activities after school. They'll commute by themselves to these activities, and then they'll often go to cram school, very common, and so they don't have a lot of social time. So the phones were actually really helpful because when they meet new people, they could stay in touch, arrange get-togethers and so on, that would have been really hard to do otherwise because their lives were so structured, right? So in this account, the phones actually were used in a way that wasn't about insularity, was helping them build new relationships, okay? And so the point I'm making is that we have one account of phones that they have this outcome of being isolating and so on, and then we look at the reality and we find different uses depending on the population, depending on the people, depending on their social circumstances. Other studies I just want to mention have looked at mobile phones in places like Tanzania, the Philippines, Jamaica, have all found that phones have been used to facilitate the development of new relationships, particularly if people are like entrepreneurs and they have products to sell and they want to coordinate sort of things with other entrepreneurs and so on. Very helpful in those ways as well. So not about close friends and family. So the question is, why is this same technology, these early mobile devices, used differently by different populations? What's that all about? If it's the case that we can't derive too much just by looking at the technology itself in terms of social outcomes, what do we look at? What do we think about as salient? Anyone heard of the affordance approach? Right? It's a fairly common way that people think about the role of technology as people do things like interact socially. And basically the idea is that technology affords a number of possible actions, but it doesn't cause us to take those actions. There are other factors that potentially also influence us to take those actions. So if you're a teenager living in Tokyo and you want to make new friends, then you're going to look, oh, I've got this phone. I can send little messages to this person I just met. Maybe we'll get together later, right? So you're able to sort of think about the affordances of the technology. So I think it's a useful way of getting away these completely technologically deterministic accounts of things. But one of the things that I find lacking about it, coming from a sociological background, is it doesn't give us any sort of way of thinking about, well, what are these social factors? What are the salient social factors? What are the things that really influence people socially? It's kind of like the social is treated as this black box, and there's no kind of systematic way of approaching it. So I think it's a useful idea, but there's a limitation. And so, as I mentioned, I come from sociology, and so these are the sorts, this is a shot of my bookshelf, just to give you a sense of my academic background, right? So you can see, we have books by like Giddens, which I'll talk about soon, and Beck is a really big influence, and then we also have other more contemporary people like Sarah Sharma, who's in my department. Basically, as a way of trying to reconcile these things and pull in a theoretical framework that not only helps us understand the role of technology, but also what we should focus on in terms of the social world, I developed this thing that I'm calling kind of like a configuration approach. And really it's another way of thinking of both social structures and technological structures and how those two things can coexist. So anyone heard of Anthony Giddens and this idea of structuration? A couple people? the idea itself is kind of simple. Basically, Giddens is saying, if you look at social structure, which are like all the ways that we coordinate activities and do things with other people in the world, right? A university is one example. There's a lot of social structure here. People have different roles, professors have different roles, students do, and so on. You know, that seems to be obviously something that's all over our social life. But at the same time, when we look at ourselves, we realize, well, we have individual agency. We still make choices. We don't blindly follow social structures, right? Typically speaking, unless there's a lot of coercion involved. So how do we think of those two things? They seem to be in tension with each other. And Giddens says, if you think about it, agency and structure are two sides of the same coin, because we have social structure being like the rules of social behavior. And those could be explicit rules about, you know, the way I should behave in particular situations, and they could be written down, everyone knows what they are, but they could also be tacit rules. Like we have tacit rules in this situation. I'm talking and you're listening, that's a tacit rule. We know that, and that allows us to do things together, right? Like you two in this talk. So people have these rules that they follow, and then when they choose to follow them, they're enacting agency. And that then reenacts social structure, the same thing, right? So these two things are, again, two sides of the same coin. Occasionally people will not follow the rules. They're still acting agency, but then they're kind of changing social structure, challenging social structure, breaking it, right? And when you have a lot of people that challenge social rules, then you have revolutions, you have big social change. So it leaves open the possibility of social change in terms of agency, but it gives a framework for thinking about that. Okay, so all this is nothing new. My idea is, let's take this idea and sort of apply it to technology. Because when you think about it, technologies often have, they pretty much always have these rules that they follow, right? So in terms of like our phones, we have there's tons of code embedded in our phones that tells our phones how to behave, what to show on the screen, which pixels to light up, and what colors, and everything else, right? They have all these rules, and there's a set of standard protocols that they're followed often in order for these phones to work together with other technologies, right? So all of these are also rules, and they're a kind of structure or a kind of configuration, right? And technology also acts, right? It does stuff in the world. It typically follows the rules. It doesn't always, right? Sometimes it breaks, sometimes there's bugs that cooperate, or there's other sets of rules that we didn't expect. But it's still following the rules in its own way. One of the big differences between us and technology at this point, at least, is that we have reflexivity, which is this idea to be aware of the rules, to think about them, reflect them, decide if we're going to follow them or not. And technology, up until AI, hasn't. Whether or not AI has reflexivity is more of a philosophical debate. I think at this point it probably doesn't. But you know, there's the argument that it might in the future. But in a sense, it doesn't really matter for my purposes. What I'm most interested in is this parallel between these two things. And so when I think about explaining the use of technology in a particular social situation, I want to look both at the social rules and the technological rules. I want to look at how the technology operates, sort of what it does, and how people operate socially, what they do. And the idea is that when there's reoccurring actions, which again is kind of like social structure, in which both humans and technologies exercise agency, they affirm both technological and social rules. Okay? And so these practices, as new technologies come along, new rules come along technologically, we can develop new social practices which are developing new rules that make sense in those situations. Now I know this is all very abstract, so I'm going to get into the details of how this can actually be applied. But this is sort of the broad theoretical framework. Any questions about this or anything that doesn't seem quite right or you're not sure about?
Anything that how it is that technology has action, because doesn't technology enact the agency of humans?
Well, humans' agency is used to develop technologies, but technology is still acting on their own after they've been developed.
Got it.
So that's where it comes in.
After it's developed by humans. Got it.
Exactly, yeah. Other...
If not, it's the Terminator.
Right, exactly. Well, and that's the concern about AI, is that it's going to act in ways that's completely out of our control, right? But it's still acting. So it's all action. It depends on the extent to which we expect it to be an outcome or not, right? Okay, thanks very much. That was great. Okay, so going back to this book and what really sort of interested me here is, with this new framework, I want to think about what are the social and technological configurations that enable and constrain practices, communication practices, in the presence of constant connectivity, right? Because that's going back to the question, what are the implications of constant connectivity? So this is the way of thinking about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a sort of historic approach to understanding our current social configurations. Then I'm going to do the same thing with our current technological configurations and sort of show a broad trajectory in which I think there are parallels between the two. So let's start with social configurations. If we go back sort of in pre-industrial times and a lot of the world, there was this thing where the family was the unit of production. People lived with their family and they worked with their family, often on farms. That was a typical thing that a lot of people did, right? And so this was a fairly simple social situation in which you're with the same people all the time, day in, day out, working with them, right? Even if you were nomadic, you would still be living with these people and moving around with them, going to other places. There wouldn't be that you had a broad social world where you're meeting tons of different people all the time, right? The same people all the time. Then comes along industry, and suddenly there's a separation of work and family, right? Where suddenly now people are leaving the home, typically it would be the man, go to a factory and work, right? And meet new people there and have a whole social situation there that was different than what's at home, all right? And so there was this separation is sort of a big thing socially. So social life became a little more complex. Then mid-industrialization, when we had the rise of like large, government institutions, hospitals, things like this, suddenly we had more complex social roles where if you're working in these institutions, if you think about, say, a doctor, that person would interact with patients differently than with nurses, differently than with colleagues, right? Nurses would interact differently with patients and colleagues and doctors and so on. So there's more sort of role complexity. That's what we call in sociology. And then finally, more recently, we have a situation where people are often having many careers over the course of their lives, right? Many different workplaces, interacting with different people on different projects. They have different family arrangements. There's more divorce, or they're not marrying. They're having multiple partners over their lives, multiple sets of children potentially, right? So there's even more social complexity in terms of all the different roles that they play in their lives, right? And so for me, this idea of social complexity is really, it seems to be a sort of a common thing that there seems to be more and more complex social life, where that complexity means that people are in different institutions in terms of work and family throughout their lives. There's more complexity that way. They have all these different social roles they take on with all these different people they interact with. And then also there's this temporal complexity where, like you might be working with people, but they live on the other side of the world, right? Or you're trying to coordinate something about picking up milk with your partner, and it may be that they're somewhere else in the city, and they're not there, and you have to figure out when can we get together, and when you can get the milk home so we can do this other thing with the kids, yada yada. So there's a lot more social complexity in those ways. So that's the argument there, increasing social complexity. I'm going to do the same thing now with technological complexity, and I hope this is maybe even more straightforward, right? More obvious. So pre-industrial, we had the printing press, that was the main way. And I'm focusing mostly on communication technology here. But that was obviously a really big deal. It allowed for different ideas to travel among different social circles and so on. Then early industrialization, we had the postal service that came into existence around that same time, especially as we had train systems popping up around the world, allowing for more movement of mail and so on. Mid to late industrialization, we had telephone infrastructure, right, and the automobile as well. Those are really key developments technologically that allowed people to do things and became very prevalent. And then more recently, we have the internet and we have large telecommunications infrastructures, right, that are all over the world. And so these systems have become increasingly more complex that allow for all these different ways of communicating and different social interactions. So the idea here, if we even think about in the context of our mobile devices with constant connectivity, yes, they're connected to the internet, but we have many different apps that we can use to communicate with people, right? Think of all the different ways you can text someone, right? You can default texting, WhatsApp, Instagram texting, Facebook Messenger, yada, you can go on and on, right? You can have video calls in different apps, you can have voice messages, you can have all these different ways you communicate. So there's these different apps, there's a bunch of ways of communicating within each app, right? Different options to communicate. So within WhatsApp, I can call, I can text, I can leave voice messages, etc. And then we can make all those things kind of individualized. So you can set up apps to do certain things like notify you if there's certain people that call and not when others do and so on. All of this is very complex, right? And this is just a brief peek at one of the things I found in the study that I thought was relevant here. We asked people to tell us like all the different ways that they communicate with people in their lives, using all these different media, right? Calling, texting, FaceTime, Skype, etc. And then I sort of broke them down to what I think of as artifacts, or like asynchronous communication. So text messages, pictures, voice messages, video messages. And then also ephemeral communication, calling and video, right? So that's, you just have it in real time. And as you can see, like these are all within FaceTime. Okay, it's just like this, but then with something like, you know, Messenger, you have all these different options in there. So it just gives you just a sense of the complexity technologically that we have on our devices when it comes to communication. So many choices is the point. And so when I think about this in a theoretical way, I'm really interested in this intersection between this technological complexity, social complexity, these practices that we use to make it all happen, right? How when we decide to call versus text someone versus send them a voice message or whatever else. And all of this sort of assumes constant connectivity because the technological thing wouldn't work. And these practices of connection couldn't exist if we weren't always had that technological possibility. So that sort of underlies everything and allows this sort of what I call digital bonding, which is that the digital is binding itself to our social lives, and our social lives are binding themselves to the digital. Any questions here? We're past the most abstract theoretical stuff, I think. So I'll get a little more tangible. So again, for the study, another way of thinking what I'm doing is this question of how do individuals, and again, I'm sort of refining the initial question here, right? How do individuals navigate complex and social technological configurations? Because that will tell us about the social implications of the technology. Okay? Okay, so how do I actually get at all of this? And it's tough because I'm studying something that by definition is complex, right? And whenever you study something, you have to gather data and you have to try and understand it in different ways. There's a lot to approach here. So this project, I did a number of different things to try and get an understanding of what people are doing and why they're doing it. So the first question is like, well, what are people doing? You know, you can ask people, okay, like, tell me what apps you use and who you communicate with. And they'll give you a sense of things, but they're not really great at remembering that stuff. As humans, we're very limited. And so I developed this app for research with a PhD student in computer science and another master's student in computer science, where basically it's an app that exists on the Android App Store, and you give people a participant ID, and when they open up the app, they put in the ID. If they don't put in the ID, they can't use the app. It won't work for them. And as soon as they open it up, it will give them consent, basically explaining how the app works, what it does, and the way it would work is, if they agree to everything, it will take time and dates of calls and text in their logs and copy that information. It won't copy the content of the text message, it won't copy the phone numbers, it won't copy anything about who they're communicating with. It's just time and dates and like some sort of way of knowing if it's the same phone number or not without knowing the phone number. Okay? And then we would have a number of questions on screen asking them like questions like, select the name of someone with whom you enjoy discussing political or social issues from your call log. In response to that would be this random identifier, which again wouldn't be the phone number or the name or anything of that person, but it would know, okay, now this person that they have this kind of relationship with, we can see how frequently they call or text and like how often and what situations and so on. Right? So that helps sort of get at this, yeah?
Is that the data you're collecting, is that just through your standard like SMS, like built into your phone? Does that work for like say from WhatsApp or Signal?
Right, so that's a really good question. So no. Unfortunately for this project, at the time that we collected the data, which is about 5 years ago, especially in Canada, WhatsApp wasn't a common thing. About like 30-something% of people used WhatsApp, but they didn't use it as their main texting app. And so I also factored that in when I was sort of doing analysis, like, oh, are people who are using WhatsApp different and how they text and so on? No big difference. But yeah, really great question, thanks. And that's always a limitation when you're trying to get at anything in terms of digital trace data, because it's so fragmented, it's so sparse, and there's all these different, like even just getting that on Android phones was so much work, right? So there's limitations. But in any case, I had a database of mailing addresses from the university all throughout Canada, randomly selected addresses, and sent out invitations asking people to install this, do the survey, and paying them $50 if they did. Yeah.
I'm curious, is there a reason why you develop an Android app? I know that generally with app development, usually Apple's the easier option I've heard.
Yeah, but it's not in terms of accessing, calling, texting data. Yeah, and Android isn't anymore either. We had a little window where we kind of got in and was able to do it, but it doesn't work anymore like that. Yeah, yeah. iPhone's pretty locked down in those ways for good reason, I think. Honestly, like I really tried very hard to be totally upfront with people about exactly how it worked, what it did, to be really careful not to take anything private or personal that people wouldn't want, and also, of course, they wouldn't have to agree to do the study. So I was really, really careful about that. But other actors would not necessarily approach it. So I think it's good that Apple's just big lockdown. But yeah, we asked people to install this and run it. And then we had another online survey where they didn't install anything, just to make sure that the people who agreed to install were not super weird in terms of like how they answered questions. And fortunately, when I compared the online survey people who were also recruited in the same way to the app survey people, pretty much all the answers were more or less around the same. So that made me feel better about things. And when we looked at the demographics of people who completed this, they were actually mostly like the population, but they're a little on the younger side, which makes sense because they're Android users, they're willing to install an app, they're more a little technically savvy, right? Okay, and then the thing is that gives you a sense of what people are doing, but not why they're doing it. And this is where qualitative work is really helpful, right? Because if you have in-depth interviews, you can get people to explain, like, okay, so why are you texting this person? Or what situation would you do it, and why is it important to you, and everything else, right? You get that qualitative insight that you don't get from a survey. And it really turns out that I think the qualitative stuff has been the most informative, but the quantitative stuff still helps me know that I'm in the realm to generalize certain things. So there's an advantage. So it's very mixed methods. Okay, so I just want to briefly go through the main findings. And in terms of, again, these practices of connection, like how do people have understandings of what's appropriate to do and how they navigate these social situations that are complex with complex technologies, I found these 3 practices. So, and I've called them media situatedness, the division of media, and temporal boundaries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through examples that will hopefully help you understand each of these practices. I'm hoping they're fairly intuitive for you because hopefully you also practice them, or you probably do. And these are just general tendencies in the big population. There'll be individuals that have separate practices. This is not for every case. This is just looking at these general tendencies. Okay, so media situatedness. So here's a quote that I hope helps to sort of explain what this is. Okay, so this is one of our respondents talking about how she communicates with her mom when her mom's at work. She says, I call my mom because she sucks at texting, but at work she's always on her Facebook app, so it's easier to send her a message through my laptop on Facebook Messenger. Very simple, right? It's like, I know what my mom's doing, I know what she likes to do, I know in the situation when she's at work, I'm more likely to get her if I use Facebook Messenger, and that's why I do that. She's not into texting. So this is a situation which someone's very aware of the situation that her mother's in, right? Very aware of like why she wants to communicate with her. It's usually for smaller things that aren't time sensitive. And she's aware of the different media options available to her mom and that she has as well. So texting and Facebook Messenger. Obviously she would know that there's calling and other options as well. And she chooses the one that makes sense for that situation, right? So that media choice is situated in this very contextual way, based on the individual, based on a number of factors. And so if you think about, complex social and technical arrangements, the way we navigate these things is really on a situational basis. There's not some sort of, like we have general understandings of etiquette, right? Like, okay, I should probably text before I call if I don't know the person so well. We have these sort of general norms. But ultimately, in any given case, we have to reflexively decide, okay, what's appropriate here? Right? Why does this make sense? What medium should I use? And we do things that takes into effect all these complex considerations. And also when you think about the context of work, her mother being at work, that's an institution, right? And she's aware that in her mother's workplace, a call would not be appropriate, right? And that her mother is always on her computer in that workplace. So again, we sort of have to be aware of all these different things. I had another example that just came up yesterday. This is my son, Ko. And he doesn't really text with me much. He's like 11 years old. He's not a texter, which is totally fine. But he decided out of the blue just to text me yesterday. I'm in Boston. He's in Toronto. Right? I'm on this trip. I've been away for a couple days. And he just wanted to connect with me. And he knew that I was busy and that he couldn't just call me because I might be meeting people or doing things. So he sent me a message, and we just had a 20-minute little exchange. He was just he missed me. He wanted to tell me about things. And then the quote, and this is right from our exchange, he said, "Aren't devices pretty neat? You're all the way in Boston, but I can still chat with you." Sweet, right? But also, it shows a reflexivity. It's oh yeah, look at this. This technology allows me this thing that I wanted to do, even though I don't normally use it. It makes sense in this situation. So that's another example of me situating this. And in case there's any doubt that people are drawing on lots of different media with lots of different relationships, this is just a very obviously from the survey asked the percentage of people that engage in different kinds of mobile activities. Pretty much everyone texts, they call, they email. 80% use social media apps as well. This is 4 years ago, so probably social media apps have improved more. But again, it shows you that it's not that some people are only texters or some people only callers. People use everything because they have all these different situations. Okay. So any questions about that idea? Media situatus, does it make sense? Okay. Okay, so another practice of connection I'm calling the division of media. And the idea here, I'll read the quote. So this is someone talking about how he communicates with his parents who live in Hong Kong and he's in Toronto. He says, that's the next example. This one is more about when they choose to connect with different people, not parents. Okay, so this person says, Facebook is for friends and family and some neighborhood acquaintances. Instagram is a mixed bag. Twitter is mostly for business. Snapchat is for fun. I mostly use it for family and my one close friend. So you can see here that this person has different media for communicating with different sets of people, right? And that, again, this speaks to the complexity of media because we have all these different mediums and with them we have all different options to communicate in different ways. And we sort of divide them amongst our social world, generally speaking. And so it shows that because we have these complex networks, because we have all these different friends, family, neighbors, and so on, we can't have them all together in one app or even one medium. We don't call everyone, right? It really depends on the group that we're communicating with and the history of them and so on. So there's this way that we divide different media for different social groups as well. So that's another common practice. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, this is the example I was trying to set up earlier. The person who lives in Toronto, parents in Hong Kong, says, if I message my parents on WhatsApp, they don't have to read it right away. They can read it later. They can reply to it later on. So here's another example of this person has a situation in which temporally they don't want to just call their parents on the other side of the world. They might be sleeping, right? Hong Kong is a totally different time zone. Even if they happen to be awake, it might not be a good time for them. So this person recognizes, oh yeah, if I text, they'll get it when they want. They can respond when they want. That makes sense for my parents. That makes sense for me in the situation. And so it's a way of maintaining this sort of temporal boundaries. Because if we didn't do this, we could be interrupted constantly, right? Like if I had to pick up my phone every time it rang, maybe I couldn't get through this talk. I'd be interrupted 3 or 4 times, right? So we have these ways of navigating complex social life by having these temporal boundaries where we don't want to interrupt people unless we know it's appropriate. And we have this practice to know when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. Okay, so this is really critical, I think, especially for this idea of constant connectivity. We navigate it because we have this sense of temporal boundaries. And one of the big findings from the study as well is that when it comes to power within relationships, particularly often in workplace context, but power can also be when there's unequal relationships in family and so on. The power often is exercised in that people break other people's temporal boundaries. They interrupt them, right? So there's this one quote here of someone who works as a secretary in an office. She says, she has her phone on her desk. She says, because my manager wants to be in touch with me, so that's why I'm keeping my phone on my desk. Now I have that thing in front of me, so I will see it. So she's clearly not very happy about having this thing in front of her, right? And she thinks like, oh, it's the technology, it's this thing I'm not happy with. But it's also really like her relationship with her boss, who doesn't respect her temporal boundaries. Her manager is constantly interrupting her, making it harder for her to get her job done, and that's a source of tension for her, right? And that's happening because there's this unequal sort of power relationship, in which the manager has more power. So that's a big thing that also kind of is throughout the studies. Is the extent to which people are able to navigate these situations depends on the extent to which they have power to determine their own boundaries and enforce them. Okay. And so is that all clear? Cool. So just to sort of conclude, going back to constant connectivity, we have this situation where we have these devices, we're constantly connected, and we're embedded in these, the devices have these very complex technological configurations, all these different apps, all these ways of communicating. And our social configurations are also complex. We have all these different people in our lives that we have to communicate with in different ways, to do different things, both at work, family, with our friends, and so on. And all those things are managed through these practices of connection, of having temporal boundaries, of thinking the situation in which you are able to communicate, and also dividing our relationships among different kinds of media. So that's sort of how it all works. So those are kind of the social implications of this constant connectivity, these practices that we've developed in some ways to manage it. And that is the basic idea of the book, and thanks very much for coming.
We have a few minutes for questions. So.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I mean, it was interesting. Especially when you're talking about communication that happens across like countries and continents and borders. So for example, I have a group chat with my family. My grandparents and my parents live in Ethiopia. I still live in Toronto. I've got like an aunt and her family in London, my other aunt in Canada.
Right.
And we all unite on this WhatsApp group chat.
Right.
And that's like a place where we sort of have this simulation as if we're all in like the same place.
Right, right.
And so I was wondering if any of these dynamics would differ when it's group interactions as opposed to like one-on-one interactions, like person texting another person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like everyone has an idea of like when these chats are active, right? Right?
Yeah.
So there's that common understanding. So that's a great example of how like a set of people who all want to communicate in a particular way developed a practice themselves that made sense for them, right? Given their unique situation. So you probably found a time that everyone's at least awake, right? It's not in the middle of the night for some people. And so that's something that people agreed on. They went through this reflexive process, I imagine, of setting it up, or maybe a few people did, and it made sense and people got involved. So that's something that I think reflects all the things I talked about. And when it comes to like group dynamics, I think, again, the larger institution there helps explain that. So the institution is the family, it sounds like. Right? That's why everyone wants to have this communication, right? So it's a way of also creating new practices that allow that social structure to continue to exist. And people opt in, they get actively involved in that they're exercising agency in the process. So yeah, I see it as like an example of how things happen. And different families have very different ways of approaching this, right? Some families have group chats, but they're completely asynchronous, right? And other families, they just have more like smaller sets of like, oh, this is with my mom, and this is with my uncles, and whatever else, right? So it can take so many different forms. And that's why when I started like researching it, I was like, oh, this is a mess. All these different people are doing all these different things. Why is this happening, right? I was hoping to find some general patterns, but the reality is we have complex relationships, we have complex situations, and so the practices we develop are sometimes very unique for those situations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So like the themes that you come up with are inclusive of like one-to-one communication and group communication.
Absolutely, yeah. Because in both cases, like people have to figure out what makes sense for them in that situation.
Okay. Cool. Can you remind me what time period this was done over?
Right. Yeah. So it was like I started the project 10 years ago, but that was more the first like 4 years was developing this app and figuring out how to approach things and everything. And then there was like baby and blah blah blah. So it was like that's all stuff. But the actual data collection from the survey was about 4 years ago now.
Okay.
So again, this is sort of like, especially in Canada at the time, WhatsApp was not the most, it's still actually not the most popular texting app ever. But there were social media apps around. Facebook Messenger was the more dominant one. Instagram was coming in on the scene. And then in terms of the interviews, those were actually happening over really the last 5 years. The last one was probably conducted about 2 years ago. Right, so they're a little bit more like, the technology was changing with that.
Cool. I have 2 questions.
Sure, yeah.
So I'm curious, since it was over a span of a few years, did you notice were there any patterns in recontextualizing one's relationship to the technology? And I can give an example from my own personal life. I worked in consulting. We had Microsoft Teams on our phone. I'm still traumatized by it. Just getting the constant pings notifications, even like message notifications, and sure. But now I'm back here at Northeastern. They're using Microsoft Teams, and I'm like a little hesitant to put on my phone because I still have that relationship. I'm curious if you've seen how people's situations have changed, given the complexity of their relationships, that power dynamic that you mentioned, and if they kind of, if the changes to that technology have changed over time, given the change in their circumstances.
Right. You mean like that particular technology? Or
Yeah,
just,
saw any like patterns that you explored.
Yeah, I think, it's one of those things that, again, like when we were, especially because I had a number of students that were doing the interviews and they were going through lots of different kinds of personal ties and so on. Different sets of people would just have like totally different technologies they were using, and they'd be often using them in different ways as well. So I can't say that I recall anything that was specific to like Teams or any sort of technology. Not to say that it doesn't happen, but it's just that there's so many other technologies, there's so many other ways that people use them that there wasn't like one really obvious thing that emerged there. Yeah. So I think again that speaks to the complexity of both the technology and the relationships.
And secondly, given that this was 4 or 5 years ago, I'm curious if you're noticing or doing any follow-up research on the role of like AI agents in connectivity.
Yeah.
I know there are startups that are working on using AI agents to connect other people to other people, and so I imagine the connectivity can exist past temporal bounds, and I'm just curious if you see any patterns with that, or if you have any thoughts or opinions on what that could look like and how it's going to shape connectivity, given it's constantly doing stuff in the background now.
Right, totally, yeah. Like one of the things that I'm really interested in is as it becomes more integrated into scheduling.
Yeah.
Right, because up until now, if you want to schedule things together with an individual or sometimes with a group of people from work or whoever, you kind of have to go like do a doodle poll sometimes, or you have to like have conversations and so on. And my hypothesis would be that AI will start taking over that and just being like, here are the times that are best for everyone and for you. You have any preference, or like just setting it up for you, right? And then you just like, some people just like look at their calendar and like, oh, hey, it's up all this stuff for me, okay. And sort of just trusting the systems. And so I think that does potentially mean that people use less reflexivity. And I don't know if it's, assumably for some people that have the power to enforce other people to use it, it will work for them. Otherwise they wouldn't be using it. But then there'll be a whole other people, and this is where power comes in there, that are just sort of forced to use it. And it may not be optimal for them. But we won't know until it actually gets more common, I guess.
There's a startup. I use an email tool called Superhuman.
Yeah, I've heard
It's a
that.
lot of AI features, including collaborative scheduling is now the most recent feature that just dropped not too long ago. So
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
interesting.
And if you think of social structure as how people interact in recurring ways, AI will, in a sense, because it's determining when and how people interact more often, it will become, in a sense, social structure, right? Or the thing that creates social structure, and will follow through on it distinctly. So that is, it's a whole unknown kind of worms there. It's going to happen, how it's going to play out.
Last question.
Yep.
AI friends, thoughts, opinions on
Yeah.
their role in connectivity. I know there's a lot going on with that.
Yeah, like when we have chatbots that we feel connected to, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Like I don't know. Like clearly there's a psychological side of it, right? And that's interesting. But that, as a sociologist, that doesn't interest me too much. But what does interest me is the extent to which people see it as like a part of their social lives, and if it influences how they make decisions, how they get support. Because within sociology, I look at like support networks quite a lot. How people get help, how they can mobilize to do things with other people. I think that's what really interests me about that. I'm not sure how it's going to play out. It's a question. Yeah, we'll see.
voice. Like,
Is the mic on?
I don't know.
It's not working.
It's
not.
I've got a loud voice, don't worry. So this is outside of my expertise, so please excuse me if I mix up any terms. I was actually curious about the content of the communication and the form of communication that people tended to use for that content.
Right.
So like say for political conversations, did people tend to use more artifact-based communication, more ephemeral communication?
Yeah, I would say it will depend on who they're communicating with, because like through social media, they'll have posts that maybe people in the networks have posted. So if you think of that as a type of communication, right, and that's all artifact-based. If we think about communication when people are just hanging out and talking, some people hang out and talk about politics. That's the thing that people do, right? You know, that will probably tend to be with closer friends or family maybe, and that's something that would be obviously synchronous, right? And there may be other situations where people who are really politically active or whatever will have synchronous calls with other people, or voice calls, or Zoom meetings, or whatever, to talk about those things. So, yeah, I guess I would hypothesize that the type of relationship relates to the medium to some extent, and that's the division of media that I talked about earlier.
Two things. One, I think that's an interesting question to ask. I had friends previous years ago who were active in the political spaces and would actively like put their phones in like boxes in the fridge, like while having meetings to not have any type of signal kind of go through while they're having certain discussions. And that's pretty interesting. And I have another thought is that concept of like ephemeral and artifacts kind of being produced. I'm curious if you think that we're going to see more artifact-based sort of communication come up, especially in the rise of, say, like AI transcription tools for meetings and things of that nature, because you're having the ephemeral in the audio and the you know, the video and visual, right? But then you're producing these, you know, artifacts, transcripts, analysis of things being said, everything like that, in a more artifact-based way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like there's a whole issue of privacy and surveillance, and like in that case, I think that's a big thing, a big concern for a lot of people. And one of the things I also think is concerning in the context of AI is, well, you know, it used to be that there was all these digital artifacts that are asynchronous, right? That exist about people, but the data sets are so massive, they're all like different formats. It's like, even though that data is out there, it's hard for anyone to make sense of it. They have to be really motivated to do analysis and really get it all to work. Like I know, I've worked with R to like piece together multiple data sets. It's so much work, and it's like at the end of the day, you know, you don't even necessarily get good stuff coming out of that process. But you'll have AI systems, I'm sure they already exist, that are designed to make profiles on people, right, for different actors, for different contexts. And they could be government actors that want to sort of control things politically. They could be companies that want to profile people so they can sell things or whatever. You know, so this happens, and the AI systems will be really good potentially, or at least even if they're not good, they'll still be used to infer a lot about people from all these different data sources and try to make these understandings of people's political meanings and so on. So yeah, I think it's a big deal for sure.
Any more questions? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I'm curious if you imagine any of the research findings that you found being different, say if you had done the studies in the US versus Toronto, and especially in the last few years politically, you think you would have seen any different results, anything more kind of standing out?
Yeah. I mean, we didn't focus too much on politics or political stuff. It was actually one thing we did look at, but not like in a lot of detail. And so, you know, in Canada it's a little different politically, but not vastly different, right? Like a lot of countries are far right. Left, the typical sort of, and there's a lot of influence in Canada, obviously, from the US. Canada's also unique in that, so like in the larger population, but especially in Toronto, there's a lot of people who were born in other countries and have moved to Canada, right? So in Toronto, about 40% of people who are living in the Toronto area were not born in Canada. So I think that's also one thing that's a little unique about people. And I think ultimately just means there's going to be a lot of complexity that way in terms of people's networks and their norms about how they communicate, like, you know, within families, the importance of like how you communicate with elders. In some families that's a big deal, right? And they tend to be families from certain cultural locations. And other families it's not as much, right? And so you have a lot of diversity that way probably because of the large number of immigration you have. Thanks.
What came to mind with what you're saying is how, I mean, part of me is having a lot of anxiety about the fact that we can't get away from constant connectivity and remembering, and we're probably, you know, one of the few people in the room that remembers when you didn't know anything until you got back home. But yeah, I was thinking about that, about how kind of different generations have adopted technology in different ways. And so there's certainly people in my family that are not adopting and not planning to adopt anything beyond email, and still prefer letters and things like that. So was their life simpler? You know what I'm saying? That's kind of what I'm thinking is our life you know, more complicated? Have we made our lives more complicated because of this constant connectivity? Of course, as it is afforded to solve some problems, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the trajectories we had. We've always had, like, for hundreds of years, we've had increasing social complexity, technological complexity, but they enable each other, right? So, like the Industrial Revolution, that's all technology, right? That enabled that separation of family and work. And now we have all these different apps, and they allow us to maintain a sets of relationships that maybe we can never have maintained in the past, because people just move to places, and once they move to places, you lost touch with them. You know, you're not going to pick up the phone and pay $10 to talk to them for 10 minutes unless you're really close to them, right? So we have all these relationships that are like maybe kind of weaker in some ways, or kind of dormant, but they stick around. So that's a new thing maybe that's a result of that. But maybe older generations don't.
Yeah, and then the younger generation that don't have to learn how to solve problems because they just call someone, you know, their parents.
Right, or AI does it for them.
Right. So you know, it's not determinism, but it certainly changes what communication.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking also, because we have like a lot of like a group and like our colleagues in mobile communication that do a lot of research on this connection and well-being, exactly to address this kind of overwhelming thing that we feel that having multiple channels of communication, right? And I was telling Jeff that one of the things that I always thought I was very good at managing the multiple channels, but at some point, you know, like you're always on because there comes communication from all places, and I kind of deleted my work email from my phone. And so, because sometimes you, like you're saying that in the industrialization that you had the separation of work and life, right, and family. But I think we're already talking about that with the internet, but now with all these channels, I mean, it's so mixed up that we need to develop new social norms, how to deal with that, right?
Exactly.
Most people don't know what to do.
Right.
Still.
Yeah, some people often feel overwhelmed, and it depends on the sort of power dynamics within the relationships if you have any control over it too.
And do you think that the pandemic accelerated the constant aspect of this? Because you know, suddenly you couldn't see people in person, so you had to adopt some of these technologies and install these apps even if you didn't want to.
Yeah, I mean, you hear about that a lot in the context of workplaces and universities where people got used to online meetings. So I remember before the pandemic, I used to have to come to campus for every meeting, and these days it's more a norm to hold a lot of meetings by Zoom, right? So we've developed these new practices that maybe they would have eventually developed anyways, but the pandemic kind of accelerated that because we didn't have other options. So we had to develop new practices.
But you said you collected a lot of your data 4 years ago. That was post the pandemic.
That's right. Yeah. Some of right. So actually, you're right. So it's a little more like 5. It was just before the pandemic. Okay. The survey data was collected, and then the interviewing data was like before, during, and after. Yeah. And I thought when I was writing the book, like, do I want a whole pandemic section? And I was like, no. I mean, because it's it would be its own book.
Well, with that said, I just wanted to thank Jeff for the talk and just say that, you know, we're going to have still time for networking. There's some snacks there if you want to kind of stay around and talk to him. And we also have books for signing
over there as well. So thank you.